Thank you for coming. So here we are again. It seems like every time we're together, it's a new crisis, new something else taking the underlying issues that are at the core of every problem off the table. I know we're all horrified right now about Ukraine and everything that's going on there. Jolt Inform sent out an email today about some actions you can take. We really want to call upon you to support President Biden right now and be vocal about it. There's some contacts in the email. And we're also very concerned with Fox News being played on basically a loop in military bases. And we want to see if there could be some action to not have it there, or at least have some sort of a fairness doctrine type of thing where MSNBC and CNN have to be played at equal time, because we can't afford to have the military brainwashed. And we want you to take a look at whatever pensions you may be in, whatever financial investments you may have, anything that's anything to do with Russia, get the hell out of it. Any business contacts anywhere on the ladder, up or down, and let them know that, to please spread the word and please, divest and get out of Russia as much as possible. And that does tie into what we're talking about here, because if anything it reminds us of the danger of tyranny and the danger of depriving people of the vote and the danger of undermining democracy. It is in our face right now. When you have so much power in the hand of one person, and when that person ends up just being a madman, even if that person isn't, but it just underscores how important democracy is, how important a system of government is, and how important our right to vote is, because without our right to vote, it would be without the ability to vote freely and fairly and without impediments, democracy is compromised, and we cannot afford that. We cannot afford to risk minority rule. And so we are privileged today to have presenting for us two speakers from our favorite place, the Brennan Center for Justice, where they just do such incredible work, keeping the community informed, trying to keep citizens like us informed, and also just, bringing judicial cases, et cetera, to protect our rights, and publishing terrific articles to keep intelligent information flowing. So we have with us today Katie Friel, who is a new fellow there. She's, I guess, a pretty recent law graduate, and she got her, looking for this because I unfortunately just got the information. Okay. Yeah. So she's you at JD at Columbia, right? And you were the vice president of the ACLU on your campus. And you clerked for the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District, and the ACLU project, and the Southern District of New York. And we also have, Katie will be presenting on voting rights and the history. And we also have Harry Black, who was a clerk in the Northern District of New York. He was clerked on the appeals court, the 5th District, worked at Cravath, Swaine and Moore, got his JD for NYU, where he got an award for the most outstanding note, which is really very, very impressive. Those of us who have been on law review or near there know exactly what that is. And worked for Teach for America. So we've got some very good legal minds here, and Harry will talk to us about gerrymandering and redistricting. There's way more insidious ways to oppress the vote, as we know, than to turn people away from the polls, and potentially way worse, because they are insidious. So thank you, guys. They're going to talk for a while and then take some questions. So welcome, everybody.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm going to figure out how to share my screen right now. And let me know if you can see the slides.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. I am Katie Friel, as Kathy mentioned, and I'm so excited that you guys have invited us here tonight. This conversation on voting rights and protection of our democracy couldn't be more timely, as you all know. So I want to talk a little bit about the current threat on voting access and provide some background on how we got here. So here we go. So last year we saw a huge surge in voting legislation, and this trend seems to be continuing into 2022. A lot of this legislation is being enacted in response to what we saw in the 2020 election. So that election saw the highest voter turnout in the past century, and by all accounts was a secure election across the board. And we should be celebrating that. And unfortunately, in response to that record turnout, a number of states across the country have been enacting restrictive laws that make it harder for Americans to vote. So in 2021, at least 19 states enacted 34 laws that make it harder to vote. And with the 2022 legislative sessions starting in all but 15 states as of January 14, state lawmakers are already considering hundreds of bills aimed at voter access in the electoral process. Legislators in at least 27 states have introduced, pre-filed, or carried over 250 bills with restrictive provisions, compared to just 75 bills in 24 states at the same time last year. This year, in addition to tracking bills that restrict and expand voting access, we're also tracking legislation that would undermine the electoral process. So as of January 14th, legislators in at least 13 states have pre-filed or introduced 41 bills that would undermine the integrity of the electoral process and empower partisans to manipulate election administration and election outcomes. So a number of the restrictions that we're seeing seem to be focused on limiting mail voting, which was widely used in the last election. So over half of the restrictive bills that were pre-filed or introduced in 2022 target every stage of mail voting, including who can vote by mail, adding new barriers to applying to vote by mail, adding restrictions on returning mail ballots, and adding new grounds for rejecting mail ballots. We've also seen restrictive bills around things like strict voter ID laws, voter registration, and voter purges. And an emerging and quite concerning trend is new criminal penalties for election officials and others that are involved in the voting process. So for example, in Georgia, people can now be charged with a crime for handing out water and snacks to voters waiting in line to vote. In Iowa and Kansas, people can face criminal charges for returning mail ballots on behalf of voters who may need assistance, such as voters with disabilities. And in Texas, election officials can face criminal prosecution if they encourage voters to vote by mail. It's also especially important to note that many of these laws will disproportionately affect voters of color, either by design or in effect. So voters of color are disproportionately impacted by things like polling place closures. They're more likely to wait in line and to wait longer at the polls to vote. They're less likely to have the right ID that's required by these strict voter ID laws. And they're more likely to have their mail ballots rejected than white voters. Now, when it comes to the election sabotage laws, undermining the integrity of the electoral process, this legislation ranges from allowing any citizen to initiate or conduct new biased election audits, to imposing new criminal or civil penalties on election officials for making unintended errors, and allowing partisan actors to remove election officials from office. With these bills, state lawmakers are doubling down on their efforts to undermine voters' trust in elections. The legislation would open the door to manipulating election results for partisan reasons over accuracy. So on the expansive side, what we were seeing states do last year to expand voting access, a lot of that involved codifying procedures that were put in place by states to combat the worst effects of the pandemic in 2020. So things like mailing ballots to all voters, implementing curbside voting, allowing everyone to vote by mail. These are things that states were now putting into their laws as permanent solutions, whereas in 2020, a lot of them were just put in place temporarily. So that's what's happening right now. And I want to provide a little bit of background on how we got here. So first, I want to talk about the civil rights movement, and particularly the 1960s. So this was a time when Black activists were in the streets, staging protests and sit-ins, and fighting for the right to participate in our democracy. You may recall an event called Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, the anniversary of which we just celebrated a few days ago. So on March 7th, 1965, Black civil rights activists were attacked by state troopers as they traveled from Selma to Alabama's state capital to demand the right to vote from their governor. Selma is often characterized as a tipping point in the civil rights movement because the events were photographed and recorded, galvanizing public opinion and ultimately persuading Congress to finally take action. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Congress just 5 months after Selma. And the VRA was passed to ensure that state and local governments don't deny American citizens the equal right to vote based on their race, color, or membership in a language minority group. And its immediate effect was to outlaw certain voting practices that were being used to disenfranchise Black and other minority voters, things like literacy tests. And by the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters were registered to vote. At the center of the VRA's success was a process called pre-clearance, which you may have heard of. This was set out by sections 4 and 5 of the VRA. Section 4 established a coverage formula for determining jurisdictions that would be subject to pre-clearance based on that jurisdiction's history of race-based voter discrimination. Section 5 set out the pre-clearance process. So the jurisdictions that were covered by the formula in Section 4 had to abide by the process set out in Section 5, which required those jurisdictions to get any changes to their election laws approved by either the DOJ or a federal court before they could actually implement those changes in a future election, to make sure that those laws wouldn't have a racially discriminatory effect. For nearly 50 years, pre-clearance was massively successful at improving voting access in covered jurisdictions. And that brings us to Shelby County. So 9 years ago, the Supreme Court effectively gutted pre-clearance. In Shelby County v. Holder, a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court effectively made Section 5 inoperable. The Supreme Court held that the formula used in Section 4 to determine which states were subject to pre-clearance was out of date. The Voting Rights Act had worked, they said. There was no longer a need to subject those jurisdictions to pre-clearance. This prompted the famous quote by Justice Ginsburg in her dissent that throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing out your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And exactly as Justice Ginsburg predicted, the decision immediately opened the door to restrictive voting laws. Texas passed a restrictive voter ID law just hours after the court's decision, and North Carolina mere months. And we're seeing the consequences of the absence of pre-clearance to this day. The racial turnout gap has grown since the Shelby County decision, and jurisdictions formerly covered by pre-clearance have increased rates of voter purges when compared to other jurisdictions. And the absence of pre-clearance is also a big impetus in the 34 laws that we saw enacted last year. So to bring it back to the present day, because of Shelby County v. Holder, there's no federal gatekeeping to prevent many of these discriminatory laws from going into effect. Much of the laws that have been found to be intentionally discriminatory against voters of color or have a disparate impact against voters of color were determined by courts in response to litigation. But without pre-clearance, there's no broad means of preventing these laws from going into effect in the first place. Second, much of what we saw last year was a rush to enact legislation on the false premise that our elections are riddled with widespread fraud. This isn't a new claim, but it remains a racist one at its core. Politicians have used false rhetoric about rampant voter fraud to justify things like strict voter ID laws that disproportionately affect voters of color and restrict access to voter assistance. In 2020, accusations of voter fraud were specifically targeted at certain diverse cities: Milwaukee, Detroit, Atlanta. The racial element of these allegations about voter fraud is impossible to disentangle. And we're seeing state lawmakers seize on that same lie about voter fraud, same lies about election irregularities, to introduce policies that make it harder to vote. For example, the Omnibus Texas bill, Senate Bill 1, prohibits or curtails drive-through voting, 24-hour voting, and mail voting, the very voting methods utilized in unprecedented numbers in the state's election in 2020 in the most diverse counties. And for what it's worth, in study after study, it's been found that voter fraud is a vanishingly rare phenomenon. So, unfortunately, we're seeing a country divided. Some states are working hard to expand voting rights and others to restrict them. Access to the right to vote increasingly depends on the state in which a voter happens to live. We're currently tracking 60 active lawsuits in 20 states and DC. And these cases are in federal court, in state court. They range in the claims that they bring. Some are under federal voting rights laws, some are under the US Constitution, state laws, state constitutions. And these include challenges to some of those 34 laws that were passed last year, So half of the 34 laws are subject of current ongoing lawsuits. Our colleague, Sean Morales, just argued before the Fifth Circuit this week in one of our Texas cases, challenging a provision of Texas's law that makes it a crime for election officials to solicit mail ballot applications from voters. A couple weeks ago, the district court issued an injunction meaning that the state wasn't allowed to enforce that provision. Texas just held an election and will hold another in May before the general election in November. So the Fifth Circuit's decision on whether or not Texas is allowed to enforce this law has real and immediate effects on voters in Texas. In early February, a trial over Florida's new law took place and a ruling by the judge is expected soon. Trials are also set to begin in Iowa and Arkansas next week over restrictive bills that were passed in those states last year. And as some of you may know, the future of mail voting is a big subject of litigation, and it's currently being litigated in states like Pennsylvania and Arizona. And the future of drop boxes is also being widely litigated, particularly in Wisconsin. In fact, as a result of recent decisions by state courts in Wisconsin, drop boxes won't be allowed for the state's upcoming election in a few weeks. And so in 2021, at least 47 cases were filed in 15 states that we're tracking. And so far in 2022, at least 5 cases have been filed in Arizona, Delaware, New York, and Texas. So what can you do?
Yeah.
First and foremost, register to vote and vote in every election, no matter how small, and encourage your friends to vote. Civic engagement is honestly contagious, so talk to your friends and educate them on how these laws might impact them. Engage your state lawmakers and educate them on the impact of their laws on voters, and do the same with your federal representatives. Encourage your federal representative to pass federal legislation, to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, to pass the Voting Rights Advancement, the John Lewis Act. Get involved with some of the local organizations on the ground doing this work in your state, because those local groups are very effective at mobilizing efforts and helping you figure out what may be the high priority items in your area. So that's a look at voting rights today. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Harry Black, to talk about redistricting.
Thank you, Katie.
Much, Katie. Good evening, everybody. I'm just going to get my slides set up here, and then we should be good to go. All right. Can everyone see my my slides?
Yeah.
Great. All right. So once again, my name is Harry Isaiah Black. I'm the George A. Katz Fellow here at the Brennan Center, and tonight I'm going to talk about the 2022 redistricting cycle, successes, limits, and solutions. So first, I'm going to provide an overview of what redistricting entails. I'll then discuss some of the trends that we've seen this cycle, and then some solutions to correcting abuses in the redistricting space. So first, an overview. What is it? Members of Congress, state legislatures, and many county and municipal offices are elected by voters grouped into districts. But populations change. Some districts gain residents, others lose them. Districts also may change demographically. That's why district lines need to be periodically updated so that legislative bodies can, as John Adams once said, reflect an exact portrait, a miniature of the people at large. Redistricting is the process of updating those boundaries. When is it? Generally speaking, redistricting occurs when a new census is completed, which is every 10 years. A new census was completed last year, which means all 50 states are either currently in the process of redistricting or have drawn new maps. Most states are done with their map drawing. Why should we care? Redistricting affects the balance of power at the federal, state, and local levels. That balance in turn affects how elected officials make decisions that impact all of our lives. According to the 2020 census, nearly all of last decade's population growth occurred within communities of color. Redistricting is an opportunity to ensure that our maps reflect this growing diversity. Who draws the maps? Given the importance of redistricting, it can create powerful incentives to manipulate district lines for political gain, a process called gerrymandering. American attempts to tailor district lines for political gain stretch back to the early 19th century. The term gerrymandering originated in 1812 as a word to describe the redrawing of Massachusetts' state Senate map. Then governor of the state, Elbridge Gerry, adopted a plan that ensured his party's domination of that legislative body. As you can see from this slide, an editorial artist added some wings, claws, and the head of a particularly fierce-looking salamander creature to the outline of one particularly notable district, grouping towns in the northeast part of the state. The beast was dubbed the gerrymander in the press, and the practice of changing district lines for political gain has kept the name ever since. Gerrymandering is most often based on race or partisanship, i.e. political affiliation, and tends to occur when line drawing is left to legislatures and one political party controls the redistricting process. In recent years, however, we've seen significant growth in efforts to protect the redistricting process from abuse. While the vast majority of states continue to let their legislatures draw districts, there has been a growing movement toward alternative approaches to map drawing. So let's look at some of these approaches. Today, line drawing responsibility in states falls into four broad categories: states where legislatures draw maps, states that have advisory commissions draw maps for legislative consideration, states that use independent commissions to draw maps, and finally, states that use political appointee or politician commissions. State legislatures draw congressional districts in 28 states and legislative districts in 28 states. Generally speaking, plans in these states need only a simple majority in each chamber of the legislature to pass and are subject to veto by the governor. One party controls the legislature in 24 of those 28 states, and of those 24 states under single party control, Republicans control 75% of them. Advisory commissions draw both legislative and congressional maps in 7 states. Vermont has an advisory commission for legislative districts only. In all of these states, advisory commissions recommend redistricting plans to the legislature, which then decides whether to approve them. The advisory commissions generally consist of legislators, non-legislators, or a mix of the two. Independent commissions draw both congressional and legislative districts in 4 states. Independent commissions are made up of members who are neither public officials nor current lawmakers and are selected with the help of a screening process conducted by an independent entity. That screening process vets would-be commissioners for conflicts of interest, and in some states also makes an assessment of applicants' skills, qualifications, and aptitude. All current independent commissions include independents and/or members of third parties, as well as members of the 2 major parties. Unlike advisory commissions, independent commissions have the authority to enact final maps. Finally, political appointee commissions or politician commissions draw legislative districts in 10 states and congressional districts in 5 states. While they also have the authority to enact final maps, they have far fewer conflict of interest rules than independent commissions, and commission members are often picked precisely because of their close ties to the political process or connections with elected officials. Members of political appointee commissions are non-elected officials, but are directly selected by elected officials or, in some states, by political parties. Politician commissions are even more tied to the political process, consisting of actual legislators and/or statewide officials. Where are the lines drawn? While map drawers tend to have a lot of discretion in how they draw maps, there are some limits as outlined in federal law, state law, and US Supreme Court precedent. Here are the key limitations, most of which were born out of the civil rights era, as Katie was describing. In 1964, the Supreme Court issued 2 rulings requiring congressional and legislative districts to be roughly equal in population. First case is Westbury v. Sanders, that's for congressional district, districts, and then Reynolds v. Sims, that's for legislative districts. The following year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, or the VRA. Section 2 of the VRA prohibits voting practices or procedures that have the effect or purpose of discriminating on the basis of race, color, or membership in one of several language minority groups. 2 years after that, Congress mandated single-member congressional districts. This legislation served as a guard against drawing multi-member districts to dilute minority voting power. There are also Supreme Court cases that hold a state cannot redistrict on the basis of race unless doing so serves a narrowly tailored, compelling state interest, such as complying with the VRA. And other cases hold that the US Constitution forbids intentional denial of the right to vote on account of race. Finally, many states require that map drawers adhere to traditional redistricting criteria, such as compactness, contiguity, and keeping communities of interest together. A community of interest is a neighborhood, community, or group of people who have similar legislative concerns and so would benefit from being maintained in a single district. There's a lot of variety among these traditional redistricting criteria among the states, however, and so that leads to sometimes widely different maps in different places. Next, I'm going to talk about trends so far this cycle. The first trend is a continuation of extreme partisan gerrymandering from the last cycle. 39 states have completed the redrawing of their congressional maps by this point, not counting the 6 states with only one at-large congressional district, while 40 states have finished their legislative maps. So we're nearing the end of the redistricting cycle. As you can see via the orange highlighting on the maps, many states are gerrymandering their congressional and legislative districts to achieve a political advantage. The extreme partisan gerrymandering this cycle is driven in large part by a 2019 US Supreme Court decision in Rucho v. Common Cause. Rucho held that constitutional challenges to partisan gerrymandering cannot be pursued in federal courts because they are so politically charged that federal courts, which are typically viewed as apolitical branches of government, should not hear those cases. Given the Rucho decision and the fact that Republicans control the drawing of 187 congressional districts this cycle to Democrats 75, some election experts concluded that Republicans would be able to retake the House of Representatives in 2022 from partisan gerrymandering alone. Yet, as we wind down this cycle, Democrats have gained more congressional seats than Republicans. This is due to aggressive map drawing by Democrats themselves in states such as New York and Illinois, as well as state court decisions overturning Republican gerrymanders in Ohio and North Carolina. Another notable feature of this decade's maps is that they will be far less competitive than those that preceded them. Most of the reduction in competition has come in Republican-controlled states. This has much to do with the defensive nature of this cycle's Republican gerrymanders. In contrast to past decades, during which Republicans aggressively tried to convert Democratic seats into Republican ones, this time around, Republicans are far more focused on shoring up their incumbents and locking in the gerrymanders established 10 years ago. Take Texas as an example. As you can see from the graphic, Republicans gerrymandered the new map by increasing the number of safe Republican and Democratic seats at the expense of competitive districts. There's only one district, Texas 5, where the 2020 presidential margin of victory would have fallen within 5 percentage points under the redrawn map. The strategy of defensive gerrymandering is a product of electoral outcomes from the previous redistricting cycle. To create more Republican-leaning seats in 2010, the GOP had to spread its voters across districts, which resulted in Republican districts that only slightly leaned Republican. Demographic changes and political shifts, particularly in suburban districts where white voters deserted the GOP, allowed Democrats to flip many of those districts in 2018. Thus, to avoid electoral losses, Republicans have decided to shore up the remnants of their gerrymander rather than try to flip back additional Democratic seats. Some redistricting experts have argued that the outcomes of this redistricting cycle are much better than expected, given Republicans' defensive redistricting strategy. But those arguments overlook several negative consequences of their efforts. First, a gerrymander is still a gerrymander. Seats that were competitive in the past are now no longer so. Second, and most importantly, the Republican defensive gerrymanders harm communities of color by failing to create or maintain districts in which minorities are able to influence the outcome of elections. So do offensive Democratic gerrymanders, which we've also seen this cycle. For the reasons I've been discussing, that puts Democratic-leaning districts at risk of a Republican takeover, which could harm many minority communities that tend to support Democrats. Some commentators have described the Democratic-drawn Illinois congressional map as precisely this kind of dummy-mander. This brings us to our third trend, which is attacks on communities of color this cycle. It is no surprise that many of the maps that are most skewed from a partisan perspective also heavily discriminate against voters of color. Racial and ethnic minorities have long been principal targets in redistricting, whether for racially discriminatory reasons or for partisan reasons or both. Discriminatory line drawing has been rampant in the South, where for the first time in 6 decades, as Katie was telling us, states are no longer covered by the pre-clearance requirements of Section 5 of the VRA as a result of the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby County v. Holder. People of color are driving population growth nationally, and especially in several southern states that required pre-clearance: Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. Yet free of the constraints posed by Section 5, Republican mapmakers in those 4 states haven't just declined to create any new electoral opportunities for fast-growing minority communities. In many instances, they have dismantled existing districts where communities of color won power or were on the verge of doing so. In Alabama, all the state's population growth was among people of color, including Blacks, Alabama's largest minority group. Under the new congressional map, however, Black voters have the opportunity to elect a candidate of choice in only 1 of 7 districts, 14% of districts, despite making up around 27% of the state's voting age population. Additionally, the Alabama legislature failed to create another Black state legislative opportunity district in Montgomery. Federal trial courts struck down Alabama's new congressional map, but the Supreme Court stayed that decision, likely leaving that map in place for the 2022 election cycle. Litigation challenging the new legislative maps is also pending. Although communities of color account for nearly all of Georgia's population growth over the past decade, the state's new congressional map does not create any additional minority opportunity districts. The Georgia legislature also could have added more than 6 new Black opportunity districts to the legislative maps. Litigation challenging Georgia's new maps is pending. Between 2010 and 2020, North Carolina's population grew by almost 1 million people, with people of color accounting for 88% of that growth. This growth entitled North Carolina to an additional congressional seat. However, under the new congressional map, Black voters have the opportunity to elect a candidate of choice in only 2 of 14 districts, 14%, despite making up around 30% of the state's voting age population. The North Carolina legislature also could have added at least 7 Black opportunity districts to the state legislative maps. As we'll discuss in more detail a bit later in the presentation, the North Carolina Supreme Court invalidated the state legislature's new congressional and legislative maps and ordered the legislature to adopt a new set of maps. Texas's population grew more than that of any other state between 2010 and 2020, with non-white Texans accounting for 95% of that growth. Despite this population increase, which gave Texas 2 additional congressional seats, lawmakers drew no new minority opportunity districts. The Texas legislature also reduced the number of Latino opportunity districts within the state legislative maps, even though Latino Texans are close to becoming the state's largest ethnic group. Litigation challenging Texas's new maps is also pending. Finally, let's look at successes and limits of reforms in the courts. Our discussion of this cycle's trends so far paints a somewhat bleak picture, but there's one significant bright spot. Independent commissions work and better account for our country's growing diversity than other models. Compare the outcomes of this redistricting cycle in California and Texas, for example. Communities of color drove population growth in both states. In California, the state's independent commission produced maps that significantly increased electoral opportunities for communities of color, the Latino community in particular. But as we've discussed in Texas, where the maps are drawn by the legislature, the opposite occurred. Another unfortunate trend is that legislatures are willing to ignore advisory committee recommendations. If there were any hope that state legislatures would necessarily defer to advisory commission recommendations, that promise was dashed this cycle. For instance, in Utah and New York, partisan lawmakers simply overrode maps passed by advisory commissions to adopt gerrymandered ones, albeit with starkly different results. Under the Utah Commission's recommended congressional map, most of Salt Lake City would have been contained in a Republican-leaning but highly competitive district. However, Republican lawmakers wholly ignored the commission's proposal and instead passed a map that split Salt Lake City among each of the state's 4 congressional districts. As a result of the fracturing of the state's largest and most Democratic region, all 4 of the districts now are safely Republican, and likely will be for the entire decade. In New York, the Redistricting Commission failed to produce bipartisan congressional and legislative maps. Instead, the commission released one set of Democratic drawn maps and one set of Republican drawn maps. The state legislature ignored those proposals, instead adopting its own maps. The new congressional map in particular is heavily biased in favor of Democrats. That map created 20 Democratic-leaning seats, only 4 Republican-leaning seats, and 2 highly competitive seats, both of which tilt toward Democrats. This is an increase of 3 Democratic-leaning seats, a decrease of 3 Republican-leaning seats, and a decrease of 1 highly competitive seat from the old map. This round of redistricting also includes at least one cautionary reminder that state courts may not always be willing to police abuses, as they are generally made up of partisans themselves. In North Carolina, Democrats narrowly control the state's Supreme Court. In a case decided along partisan lines, a 4-3 majority of the North Carolina Supreme Court invalidated the Republican legislature's new congressional and legislative maps, finding that the maps were a partisan gerrymander in violation of the North Carolina Constitution. Because Republicans sought to achieve an amount of partisan advantage when drawing the maps that did not accord with their level of statewide support among voters, the court held that the maps were unconstitutional. The court then approved revised maps that are free from partisan bias. In Wisconsin, on the other hand, conservatives narrowly control the state Supreme Court, even though Wisconsin does not have partisan elections for their justices. The expected inability of the state's Democratic governor and Republican legislature to agree on new congressional and legislative maps shifted map drawing responsibility to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. In a 4-3 decision, also decided along partisan lines, the court stated that it would adopt a least change approach to creating the new maps, under the assumption that this would preserve as much of the prior decade's legislative choices as possible. But the old maps were gerrymandered in favor of Republicans, so the new maps drawn by the court unduly favor Republicans once again. Furthermore, even if state courts are willing to police abuses or are called upon to resolve a redistricting impasse, crises can ensue when courts are not permitted to draw maps. In Virginia, the state's advisory commission was unable to produce any congressional or legislative maps. As a result of this deadlock, responsibility defaulted to the state Supreme Court, which appointed 2 special masters to propose maps. Those maps, since adopted by the court, are models of partisan and racial fairness, in sharp contrast to the racially gerrymandered maps drawn by the Virginia legislature a decade ago. While further reforms to the process could make the commission less prone to partisan gridlock in the future, the process approved by voters nonetheless worked this round in preventing another cycle of gerrymandering. In Ohio, the state's advisory commission produced legislative maps, but the Ohio Supreme Court has now twice struck down those maps as partisan gerrymanders favoring Republicans. Under the Ohio Constitution, no court is permitted to draw a legislative plan. Because of this, and as counsel for several of the Republican commissioners acknowledged during oral argument, Ohio's legislative map drawing process could continue on ad nauseum, with the commission approving unconstitutional maps that are then invalidated by the state Supreme Court. Finally, I'd like to talk about some solutions to reduce gerrymandering. To stop gerrymandering abuses, the best approach is to take the power to draw congressional and legislative district lines out of the hands of state lawmakers and give it to truly independent redistricting commissions. As we've discussed, California offers a strong model. So do Arizona, Colorado, and Michigan. From these examples, we can see that independent commissions should include members who are independents as well as Democrats and Republicans, are large enough to reflect the demographic and geographic diversity of a state, have strong conflict of interest rules and a vetting process that screens potential commissioners for fitness to do the job, have clear prioritized rules to guide map drawing, including a ban on favoring particular political parties or candidates, have strong rules on transparency and public participation to ensure that the public can meaningfully engage in and help shape the process, and have the authority to enact final maps. At the federal level, we should pass reform banning partisan gerrymandering in congressional maps and reinvigorating the VRA's preclearance process for states with a history of voting discrimination. Earlier this year, Congress debated the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Under the proposed legislation, partisan gerrymandering would be banned by statute, and congressional maps challenged in federal court under the act would be analyzed at the start of the lawsuit to determine whether they had such a high degree of partisan bias as to be presumed to violate the statute. If so, the state would be barred from using it pending further litigation. Additionally, the act would similarly strengthen protections for communities of color in redistricting. States with a recent history of discrimination would once again be required to have their redistricting plans and other election law changes pre-approved by either the U.S. Justice Department or a panel of 3 federal judges in Washington, D.C. Although Congress has tabled the legislation for the time being, we should keep pressuring legislators to pass the bill, as President Biden urged just last week in his State of the Union address. We can also challenge unfair maps in court. Litigation this cycle in various parts of the country has helped level the playing field. As of today, a total of 58 cases have been filed challenging congressional and legislative maps in 21 states as racially discriminatory and/or as partisan gerrymanders. Litigation has resulted in orders from state courts to redraw legislative and/or congressional maps in Alaska, North Carolina, and Ohio. Although state courts have offered viable forums for challenging maps gerrymandered on a partisan basis, their compositions may change, making them less hospitable to gerrymandering claims next cycle. For instance, the Ohio Supreme Court swing justice faces mandatory retirement at the end of the year, and 2 of the North Carolina Supreme Court's 4 Democratic justices are up for re-election in 2022. Finally, federal courts' longtime bulwarks against racial discrimination during the redistricting process may be shifting away from protecting minorities. In Alabama, federal trial courts preliminarily enjoined the state's new congressional map, finding that the map is substantially likely to violate Section 2 of the VRA. However, the U.S. Supreme Court, now dominated by a conservative majority, has stayed those decisions pending appeal. And in Arkansas, a federal trial court has held Section 2 of the VRA does not provide a private right of action. So with that, I thank you for your time this evening, and I'm happy, along with Katie, to answer any questions.
Wow, Well, thank you very much. That was a lot of information, very comprehensive. Thank you. I'm left, everybody, please put your questions in the chat. I'm going to ask, I think you guys to ask your own in a minute. But I guess I know that the expectations are always that the Democrats might lose the House in 2022, but it sounds like with all these challenges and all, that might not necessarily be the case. It almost seems like it's leveling off a little. Am I crazy in deducing that?
No, I think that's right, Kathy. And a lot of that has to do with courts stepping in, striking down maps. Democrats are certainly helping themselves by gerrymandering on their own accord. There's still a few states that are left to finish the redistricting process. And these are Republican-leaning states like Florida and Louisiana. And so I doubt we'll see sort of the lopsided trend we're currently seeing where Democrats kind of have come away with an advantage, like a significant advantage in Congress. But yeah, at the end of the day, it may sort of be a wash, and that certainly wasn't expected going into this cycle.
Yeah, and that leads me to to the John Lewis Voting Act, which, like you said, they've tabled. There's probably a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that don't necessarily want to see partisan gerrymandering eradicated, right? So that makes it even more of a harder push. I'm sure that had something to do with Senator Manchin potentially not backing that act. I don't know what your thoughts are on the possibility of that passing, even if there was a Democrat-controlled Senate.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a very fair assumption. I think the messaging around the Freedom to Vote Act, John Lewis Act, was very much about providing fair representation to communities of color. And redistricting is only one piece of the act that was addressed, that would have been addressed by the act had it passed. As Katie was discussing as well. The act would also extend to voting rights and sort of other areas where, there's a lot of momentum to really correct a lot of the abuses of the past that minority communities have faced. But the filibuster has gotten in the way at the current moment. And, we really, as advocates, need to keep up the pressure to get that bill passed.
And lastly, and then move on to everybody else, but the obviously, I would think it'd be unconstitutional to have federal legislation requiring independent redistricting commissions. I mean, would it be, since it was left to the states to decide, et cetera? So federal legislation requiring.
Right. So there was a provision.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. So, no, please. Yeah, so there was, I think, in the House version of the bill, a provision that would mandate states to have independent redistricting commissions. That was taken out of the Senate bill, and so the bill that was ultimately put up for consideration in the Senate didn't have that provision. But yeah, I think there is an argument potentially to be made that, given the wide latitude states have under the elections clause to, define the time, manner, and place of elections, that it would be a pretty strong intrusion into their rights to control how they redraw the maps. So that unfortunately will be a debate that we'll have to have more another day.
Very interesting. Thank you. I seem to have lost my chat here, but I know that Kim Ringler had a couple of good questions in there. So Kim, do you want to unmute yourself and ask them?
Yes, I'm going to try and read them because it was so long ago. Yeah, and a couple of other people have questions. Sharon.
Yeah, we'll just go in order.
Beth. Okay. Where are my, oh, there's mine. Since pre-clearance has disappeared as a protective mechanism, what is the standard? Can you talk a little bit more about what standard must be met in order to vote, in order to strike voter suppression laws and practices? It's still possible to challenge them, just not using the same mechanism that previously existed, correct?
Right. So I guess the standard depends. It depends on what kind of challenge you're bringing. So if you're bringing a discrimination claim under the United States Constitution, for example, you have to prove intentional discrimination. You have to prove that the law was enacted with the intent to discriminate against voters of color, for example. And that's different under the Voting Rights Act. So we talked about preclearance in Section 5, and the advantage of preclearance wasn't just that it was a different standard when you were challenging these laws in court. It was that it actually prevented these laws from ever being enacted in the first, or ever being implemented in the first place. So before a state could start implementing those changes for the next election, they had to get the okay from either a district court or the Department of Justice. So that is taken away. But as I explained, you can certainly still, there's certainly still challenges taking place in court. There's ongoing litigation. So one of the reasons, because under the Constitution, you would have to prove intentional discrimination, that was one of the reasons that the Voting Rights Act was so necessary. So there was Section 5 of preclearance, but under Section 2, that Harry talked a little bit about, you didn't have to prove intentional discrimination. You could also prove that a law had a discriminatory effect on voters of color. So that after Shelby County became more important, and there were more challenges under Section 2. And unfortunately, just last summer, I think time is kind of melding together now, but I believe it was last summer, the Supreme Court issued another decision discussing Section 2 cases, and specifically in this kind of voter suppression, vote denial context. The standard used to be that the courts would analyze how the law interacted with the social and political context of that community. So they looked at a totality of the circumstances and were able to look at how those other factors were interacting with the law and how that might impact the discriminatory effect. But after the Supreme Court's decision in a case called Brnovich last summer, the Supreme Court made it harder to bring challenges even under Section 2. So among the reasons, the Supreme Court changed from the traditional factors that were used in Section 2 before, and now they're looking at guideposts. So they focus less on the social and historical context. They also look at how many voters are impacted. If it's just a small number of voters that are impacted by the discriminatory effect of a law, then that's something that the courts will now take into account. So there are definitely still challenges and avenues to be brought in court, but recent decisions by the Supreme Court have definitely made that more difficult. But just more directly to summarize the answer to your question, the standard depends on what challenge you're bringing.
Thank you. That's very helpful and interesting and appalling. I know that Mark Elias has brought or represented challengers and has described himself as very successful. Can you share, if you know, what those successes have been predicated upon?
So I believe, and I encourage everyone to also go check out Mark Elias's website, and the Brennan Center also has our own litigation tracker. So he'll go into what I imagine is more depth than I'm going to be able to provide right now in his own cases. But from what I'm aware of, so Mark Elias works with a team of lawyers that represent the Democratic Party and sometimes other plaintiffs as well. So a lot of his lawsuits, I know he was very engaged in kind of the frenzy of lawsuits going on around the 2020 election. So some of those were in an affirmative capacity, they were plaintiffs, and some of them were intervening in challenges to the 2020 election. And so I think a lot of his success surrounding the 2020 election was kind of in rebutting some of those arguments that were made, kind of perpetuating this myth about voter fraud and the big lie that the election was stolen. But he's brought cases that I'm aware of in the past couple of years under a variety of provisions. So some have been constitutional arguments, some have been under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Some plaintiffs are bringing, including Mark Elias's team, I think, are bringing claims under the ADA. So there's still a variety of claims that are being brought. They're not kind of just one type anymore.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you. Sharon, do you want to unmute yourself? This question?
Sure. Hi. So my question is, can you comment, this is for Harry, can you comment on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact? Is ratification feasible? I think we're 2/3 of the way there. It just seems to me that it is something that could neutralize heavy gerrymandering and really actually give a lot less incentive to states to gerrymander.
Yes, I'm sorry to disappoint it. I'm actually not super familiar with it, so I don't know if I have any additional information to share with you this evening. I don't know, Katie, if this is something you looked into at all. But
yeah, it's not something that I think either of us have particularly looked into before, but I do encourage all of you to take a look at the Brennan Center's resource page on our website. We have some incredible legal analysts, data analysts, political scientists that have put out some really interesting reports, and we may have a colleague of ours, though Harry and I are not entirely familiar, who might have some more information on this.
Thank you.
We should have time for like another question or two. Beth, I see your question about the District 39 mapping redrawn to eliminate parts of Sussex and Warren counties. I don't think this is so much a question for Katie and Harry. Does it improve the map for Democrats in Bergen County? I'm going to guess it makes our district, potentially make our district lean a little more Democrat. It might.
Yeah,
help
yeah. I
for
was
you.
thinking probably you would be the one to
Yeah.
answer that, or somebody else on the call.
Thank you. Clara, could you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to address the previous question on the interstate compacts, and I know that Katie and Harry, you don't have all that much information on them, but I would think that it's not binding on all 50 states, but only the states that join the compact. I mean, that's the nature of it, of the way the interstate compacts operate. But, I could be wrong.
Harry, do you want explaining the minority opportunity districts?
sure. So that's a term that stems from the Voting Rights Act. So in discussing this evening, one way is for plaintiffs to bring a direct challenge under the Voting Rights Act, saying that the map discriminates either with intent and effect on the basis of color or language minority. And in order to prove that claim under current Supreme Court precedent, you basically need to show that the minority population could actually create a district where they'd have the ability to influence the election. So that's where the term opportunity comes in. So it's like they have the opportunity to actually kind of elect the representative that they would want to elect. And traditionally that has really just been litigated in the context of like single minority groups. So like the case we saw in Alabama this year that the Supreme Court has stayed, it's a very sort of textbook Section 2 VRA case where you take, the Black population, look to see how many districts can be formed, and if more can be formed based on, what the map allows for, then there's possibly a Section 2 violation there. In the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of demographic shifts, especially in the suburban areas, where basically it's various minority groups that have now living together in certain areas. And so it raises a question that hasn't really been litigated as much under the VRA, whether you can amalgamate different minority groups to reach that like 50 plus threshold. So, if they're, the group is, or if the area is, 20% Black, 20% Latino, 20% Asian, right? Collectively, assuming they all vote the same way, that's enough to create a district, but individually, right? Each group only represents 20% of the population. So this is ongoing litigation that actually Brandon Center is involved in Texas. And so, it'll sort of, be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's thank you. And going back to national popular vote, interstate compact, I do believe that the goal of that is that when there is enough states, it becomes law. And Sharon, so I see your comment in there. I do think you're right there. Okay, so does anybody else have any questions? It's 8:03, perfect timing. Oh, Artie, want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, thank you. Just on the minority opportunity districts kind of follow up, have we seen historically that they turn into minority majority districts, or have we seen historically that they tend to increase representation so that we have more people of color, minorities being represented in those districts?
Yeah, definitely. I would say historically, the Voting Rights Act has really been a very robust way of securing representation, where especially at the congressional level, you may see states that are, with a congressional delegation that's almost entirely Republican, but there's that one Democratic representative, oftentimes a person of color, because of the VRA protections that require the creation of, at least that one district. And so I think it's been a very effective way in securing that representation. And when gerrymandering happens, and as the VRA is further diluted as a weapon to counter gerrymandering, it remains a question of what protections will be left for these communities of color that are trying to increase the representation and maintain the effective representation that they've had, some for a long period of time.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Just wanted to know if you had sort of statistics related to that.
And specifically data.
And then also whether you've seen this on a state legislative levels as well, because that's really where a lot of our fights are, right? Because while we do have them on the congressional level, I think the state legislatures that we've seen have done a lot of damage and can, help a lot as well. So I'm curious as to the minority opportunity districts and how they can help on the state legislator level.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any sort of statistics for you this evening, but as Katie was saying, our website is chock full with a lot of data on various ways that, majority and minority districts have been able to benefit communities of color. And I definitely encourage you to take a look at our website to see what's out there.
So I guess we have no other questions, and we did ask them for our presenters for 1 hour of time. Thank you. This was incredibly informative. I'm left with this. I'm left with be vigilant within our state and lobby for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act as much as we can. Put pressure on our senators who of course support it to support it even more, and our Congress people to support it even more, and get it back on the table. I find it very funny because we'll have to be vigilant in Jersey, but we know that Jersey is a world unto itself, and the whole the gerrymandering, division of districts, and it's like mafia town, separating the territories, et cetera. So that's a whole other hornet's nest. But this is what we have to work with, and we have to be vigilant here. And then I guess the last thing I'm left with is support the Brennan Center, support the ACLU so that these people can continue to bring these cases that are really so important. And we have to be on the lookout for our judges here in Jersey too. That's super important too. I think that's something that really came home to me from what you were saying, Harry, about the fact that we've got some cases overturned now in state cases, but if the judges change, we're not going to be in the same place. So, and anything else? Any other takeaways you'd like us to? Anybody else have anything, or Katie or Harry have any other takeaways? Major takeaways for us to do. This is a group, by the way, that likes to do. We like to act. I hope you're all sharpening your pens and your pencils and getting ready to get people registered, et cetera, in the coming months. But this is a group that likes to act. So if there's anything else that you want to make us do or suggest that we do, please let us know.
I guess I'd like to leave you guys with highlighting one more point on the federal legislation aspect. I mean, of course, we're very disappointed that Congress was not able to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. But I also think it's important to note, one, all the work that has been done to get to this point. It's not like it's suddenly moot because the bill didn't pass. That puts us in a better position next time for this effort. And I also think it's important to note that the bill garnered majority support in Congress, and it didn't pass because of filibuster rules. But a majority of the public, a majority of Congress support this legislation. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, and to keep in mind that everything that we have been doing for the past couple years, it's not for nothing, and it really, really matters. And it's brought us to this moment when voting rights and the stability of our democracy is at the forefront of everyone's mind, the public, of representatives, of the president. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
It's a very, very good point. But what are the chances though of reviving that bill? Is it possible?
I thought Harry was about to speak. I think we don't know. That's one angle of the kind of one piece of this puzzle of the way that the Brennan Center approaches the issues that we address. And we're going to keep fighting for it, and we encourage other people to keep fighting for it, and keep encouraging your legislators. But it's not the only tool in our belt. We obviously have try and come at this from a multitude of angles, and we are also pursuing those other strategies as well.
So thank you once again. Thanks everybody. Kate and Harry, thank you so much. We love the Brennan Center, and we'll continue to support it every way we can. And thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks everybody.